Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a panel here with a number of colleagues, and it's my honor to chair this panel, and I want to throw out a kind of conceptual question to them, a question that you might perhaps ponder yourselves. And one of the really great questions about the Holocaust is not just all of the details, this happened, that happened, and so forth, but a kind of conceptual question. I think people who are trying to absolve the Allied powers and the leaders of the Allied powers, especially Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, of any blame in the things that happened during the war, is by putting the issue conceptually in an either-or kind of framework. Either-or. And this either-or is expressed in two different ways, using one of the titles, frankly, of one of our colleagues' papers. The question is, could the Holocaust have been avoided? And the other way of putting it is, could the Jews have been rescued? Now, if you ask that question in 1940, or 1941, or 1942 for that matter, the obvious answer is no, and the subject is at an end. And everybody goes home. No one bears any responsibility for anything, because here was a catastrophe which was inexorably unfolding. Nobody could do anything about it. But this, I would suggest to you, would be a little analogous like saying, and that's what it really is, in 1941, could Barbarossa have been avoided? Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. The answer is almost certainly not. Soviet Union could have been warned by the Western powers, and it was, and Stalin disregarded the warnings, but there was nothing really that the Western powers could do about Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union. But there was something else that they could do. What they could do, possibly, was they could help the Soviet Union, or not. And they helped the Soviet Union. That's the other thing. Same thing applied to the Holocaust and the Jews, I think. It was something of an incremental problem. The question was, yes, Hitler unleashed the Holocaust. He was in control of most of Europe. That couldn't be changed. Suffering, death, and blood were a certainty. But the question is, could they have done anything about it? Could they have helped in any number of ways? The answer is yes. And did they do this? Generally speaking, no. The only things that they ever did could be described simply as working for a certain amount of deniability. One of those deniabilities was establishing the War Refugee Board in January of 1944. And as my colleague here did in his book on Mr. Dubois, the United States government allocated $1 million to the World Refugee Board when it disposed of a Lend-Lease slush fund of nearly $50 billion, generally used at the president's discretion. You know, a lot of Jews starved in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940, but they were not helped in any way by the United States. But in 1942, Greece, under German occupation, received $30 million from the United States in order to feed the hungry under the auspices of neutral governments and the Red Cross. So there are many things one can do if one wants to do them. But so this is the issue here. And of course, this treatment of either or kind of really serves to help absolve important critical decision makers of any responsibility in what occurs. I apologize for getting a little carried away, but perhaps, as you know, I am a Holocaust survivor myself. I lived in Poland from the first day of the war, September 1, 1939, until the end of the war, that is all the way through until 1945, and even somewhat beyond until I went to the US. And I was in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940 and in 1941 and in 1942. And I can also tell you, by the way, that contrary to what some people say, the Holocaust began in November of 1940 when the Nazis closed the Warsaw Ghetto and subjected people to starvation, privation, and miserable death. But what I would like to ask the panel to talk about is this business of incrementalism, or the way in which we can look at the problem by looking at the particular specifics at various times and ask questions relevant to it in terms of what did people know about these particular situations, what capabilities did they have at the time when these situations arose, and what did they do in those particular situations. Granted that nobody could wave a magic wand and make the thing go away and make the Nazis disappear. But I will share a secret with you. Much, not all certainly, but much of the literature of the Holocaust is littered with some unbelievable ideas which are completely unbelievably wrong, and that's okay. It does happen. Anyway, so I would like to turn to you, my friends, and ask you to talk about this idea of incremental or particular aspects of the Holocaust as we might look at them in a very practical way. Professor Medoff?
Thank you. Well, I think, Alex, you've raised an important point here. When we frame some of these questions in very extreme or absolutist terms, then it can be kind of misleading. We've had several speakers over the course of the last few days have used this expression: we could have saved thousands, but they couldn't have rescued millions. Our numerical system is not just thousands or millions. There are a lot of numbers in between. There are tens of thousands, there are hundreds of thousands. And so, but if you put it in this extreme black and white kind of frame, then it can be rather misleading. In another version of this, Professor Bauer, in his remarks just a few minutes ago, argued that bombing Auschwitz or the railway lines leading to it would not have stopped the murder of Hungary's Jews. It doesn't have to be that there should not have been any action unless it would have stopped the murder completely, that it would have stopped the Holocaust. I think the question to ask is, were there ways to interrupt the mass murder process? And to consider how much would have been achieved in terms of potentially saving lives if there had been any kind of interruption. It didn't have to be an either or, where either the Allies can stop the entire Holocaust and rescue everybody, or they can't rescue anybody. In fact, I might add, there was a kind of a modern incarnation of this argument by President Obama during the debate a year or two ago over whether or not the United States should intervene in Syria. And his response was, well, if we intervene in Syria, then the question will be raised, should we also be intervening here or there or anywhere else? And it seems to me the position that if you can't rescue everybody, then you shouldn't rescue anybody, is not just, I mean, it's a moral failure in one sense, but it's also a kind of a betrayal of all the humanitarian principles for which the United States has always stood. Now, in the case of Hungary's Jews, it certainly is true that by mid-July, as Professor Bauer pointed out, the deportations of Hungary's Jews had come to a halt. But the bombing requests began in late May. So had any of the bombing requests been taken at all seriously in late May or in June, it's entirely conceivable that there would have been some interruption. And what do I mean by interruption? Because Professor Bauer points out correctly that gas chambers were not the only way in which Jews were murdered by the Germans. Very true. But in Auschwitz, the peak murder rate of 12,000 per day was accomplished during the Hungarian slaughter through gas chambers. Yes, the Einsatzgruppen machine gunned to death approximately 1 million Jews. It took a lot longer. So, although, of course, Jews could and would have been killed by other means, I think there's no comparison between 12,000 who were being murdered daily, which might have been interrupted, versus much slower, less effective, less efficient methods that the Germans might have had to resort to had, for example, the railway tracks been temporarily damaged, or even if the gas chambers or crematoria had been damaged. So it's not that there was nothing that could be done because so many Jews were being killed and it was too overwhelming for the Allies. There were, as you suggest, a number of incremental or other kinds of steps that could have had some impact, such as interrupting the murder process, including in the case of Hungarian Jewry.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Madoff. Now, for instance, when we look to this question of what information did they have and what did they know, assuming really that adult statesmen are so overwhelmingly virtuous, people like Roosevelt and Churchill, that they can't possibly believe that anyone could be killing thousands of innocent men, women, and children. It's just unthinkable. Well, maybe it's unthinkable, but maybe they didn't ask the right people at the right time. And so I'll ask Professor Fleming to mention this matter. Tell us about the strenuous effort which was made by the British to find out everything they possibly could from the Polish government in exile, which was located, as you told me, in some cases in the same building where they operated, and certainly around the corner and within what may be called a local telephone call. Thank you.
Well, the Polish government in exile had a number of ways of communicating the information, as we heard today. We heard about Jan Karski, the message via courier. Jan Karski, as Dr. Rapak pointed out, was not the only one. There were many dozens, many of whom we don't know, many of whom probably died en route trying to get information, which covered a whole range of issues about what was happening in Poland. The information about the Holocaust was often incorporated in a series of reports entitled annexes. These annex reports went to the Ministry of the Interior. In addition, some very important reports went straight to the Polish Prime Minister. In these reports, titled Pro Memoria, we do find some very interesting reports about the Holocaust, especially in late 1942 into 1943, and indeed in March 1943 we have information about 500,000 Jews being killed at Auschwitz, going straight to the Polish Prime Minister. That information actually, as we know from Richard Breitman's work, reached the United States in June, the Joint Chiefs. It was published in the Polish Jewish Observer in early September and the Jewish Chronicle on the 10th of September. But in addition to this, you had radio messages, and radio messages was a very important part of the communication of what was happening in Poland in general, and also about what was happening to Jews. And there are some individuals who were particularly important in conveying news what was happening to Jews to the Allies, and we can mention Stefan Korbonsky as one, but we can also mention the head of the Home Army, who communicated alongside the head of the civilian side of the Polish underground state, the delegates, news of the Holocaust as well. And these reports come through some in 1942, a lot in 1943. Now there's a debate within Polish circles about a message sent by the head of the Home Army in August 1942, which was not passed on. And this basically gives statistics for the number of people killed, or deported rather, from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. In my view, the reason why this particular information wasn't really passed on is because of a breakdown in Polish intelligence security. Ciphers were compromised. Swedish couriers who were traveling from Warsaw to Stockholm, their operations have been busted, and that was a very important route during early 1942. This is how the Bunn report arrived in London. It was taken by Sven Norman, who I'm sure many of you have already heard about. Now, what happened when it was in London? Well, the radio reports arrived in London at the 6th Bureau of the Polish military complex, which was in London. It was handled by the 6th Bureau, and quite often some of these reports, in fact maybe most of them, were passed on to SOE. We have got some documents in queue from the Annex series, which details the ongoing slaughter at Auschwitz from June and July 1943. This information was also discussed with Foreign Office officials. The key official who should be mentioned is Frank Savary. Frank Savary, as I mentioned yesterday, had a number of posts. He was the liaison guy relating from the British Embassy to Poland in London, and he was also an advisor to the BBC. So the information was passed in that way. The information, I mean, there is an issue about how the Polish government communicated the news, and this is an area where we can maybe criticize Polish information policy to the extent that, you know, a declaration in December, a lot of efforts in June, July 1942 to get the news out were important, but in 1943 there seems to be a slackening off of efforts, at least in my view, of the information which was available. There was no real high-profile events. Now we've got to put that in British context, in which it's very difficult for the Poles to communicate and recognize that through 1943, especially after the revelation of the Katyn graves, the Polish government is increasingly marginalized and seen increasingly as a problem. And indeed, there's a very interesting letter from Churchill to Stalin in May 1943, where he talks about changing the composition of the Polish government. So we really see, you know, a mixture of priorities and the ability of the Polish government to communicate news of the Holocaust after this point in May 1943, when a great deal of information is arriving, so it becomes more difficult.
Now, Professor Fleming, if I could ask you a couple of leading questions. One of them would be, do you think that the Polish government in exile and the resistance movement in Poland would have been interested if either Franklin Roosevelt or Winston Churchill approached them and said, gentlemen, here is $25 million on the table. We hear all sorts of rumors about things which are happening in Poland. We are not really sure what is happening, but would you mind developing or putting together a search and inquiry or intelligence team to give us more information, perhaps, including perhaps even film footage of some of the things which the Nazis are doing, and maybe various other activities that your groups might be willing to do if we provide the resources for it. Do you think, Professor Fleming, that the Polish government in exile, Prime Minister Sikorski or Prime Minister Mikołajczyk, might have been interested?
I mean, this is a question about the environment in which the Polish government in London is operating, and if the signals change of what the Allies are interested in, I think that the Polish government will respond to that. So if the Allies, Western Allies, indicated that they were interested in the fate of the Jews, I think the Polish government would have responded to that. If we look at how the Polish government operated in London, we do see declarations, as was mentioned yesterday, about equality. Now, the British and the Americans are very keen on equality, at least formal equality. If they went further than that, I'm sure the Polish government would have looked at its mission in the West seen it's probably in the Polish national interest to respond to that and to do so. Now, the problem actually is that the signals from the Foreign Office especially were precisely the opposite. The signals from the Foreign Office were, we're not particularly interested in this issue. And in my view, that empowered the nationalists in the Polish National Council vis-a-vis other groups. So we have a negative discursive environment in the United Kingdom at that point.
Thank you very much, Professor Fleming. Now, I'd like to turn to Professor Tanke and ask him this question that perhaps he could tell us something about. If I was an American taxpayer and I received a letter from the Internal Revenue Service saying that I owed $50,000 this year, and I proceeded to say that I've read the letter, I've received the information, but I don't believe it. I don't believe it for a moment. And therefore, I'm going to put this letter in my drawer and continue as I always have. And then when they haul me into court, would Professor Tanke hazard a guess as to what the judge might say to me?
Go to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200.
Thank you very much, Professor Tanke. I greatly appreciate it. Well, speaking of these various particular aspects of the Holocaust and what people could do, I will turn to Professor Shushin for whatever observations he is willing to make on the matter.
Well, in this conference so far, as I sitting here and attending all lectures, and I'm thinking to look at the past events, especially things like Holocaust, probably we need to have different perspective to look at the issue. I'm very impressed by Professor Bauer said. The situation, probably what he said, means a lot of decisions were made or events finally took place because the situation changed, especially when decisions were made to change something or do something that follow the changes of the situation. Without that, probably a lot of issues were not being able to made, or it is very difficult for leaders to make a decision. And also, I believe that especially leaders who are in the position to make decision, his moral stand is very important. What he would accept, that will be determined not only by information, but also by his personality, whether he wanted to believe it or accept it, or his way to consider the issue. When I talk about this, I will take these two things into consideration. So from what I have read, those documents, and my understanding of the issue of Chinese response to the Holocaust, so I will follow those two ideas, and then that's what impressed me most.
Thank you. Before proceeding further, I wanted to mention something to the audience. You just heard a few minutes ago a presentation about the possibilities of bombing Auschwitz. Of course, Auschwitz occurred, this whole discussion is about something that occurred very late in the war. We're talking about summer and fall of 1944, by which time most of European Jews were already dead. But I did want to tell you something which will empower you. I will give you a website on which you will be able to check some of the material which has filled many books dealing with the Holocaust literature, which are absolutely wrong and complete nonsense. And one of the great nonsense stories of the Holocaust, which is perpetuated in considerable amount of literature, is the myth of Foggia airfield. It is said that until the Allies got to Foggia And until they fixed it up in November of 1943, there was no way for them to reach East or East Central Europe. These places were just not accessible. Well, guess what? Actually, from southeast England, from a place called Lowestoft, where American Air Forces, American B-17s and American B-24s were stationed since the second half of 1942, you could reach some of these places just as well. And in one interesting case, the extermination camp of Helmno, you actually could get there quicker and faster because it was closer to Lowestoft than it was to Foggia. And the distance, incidentally, between Foggia and Warsaw and Lowestoft and Warsaw is approximately identical. There is no difference. And of course, the trick here is that Lowestoft was available to the Allies or to Britain from the day the war started, whereas, of course, the other airfield, Foggia, was only, as people say, available in November of 1943. And then, of course, the argument is made, well, but by that time, a lot of the extermination camps had wound up their work and all this kind of thing and so on, which is, of course, because of this identity of distances or closeness of distances, a myth and a mythology. And let me give you a little empowering information in this matter. If you look up a website on your computer or whatever other device you have, and the website is www.worldatlas, one word, worldatlas.com, you can compare these distances. Compare the distance between Warsaw and Lowestoft. Compare the distance between Warsaw and Foggia. Compare the distance between Helmno and Foggia and Helmno and Lowestoft. And see what that happens. And then I also wanted to tell you something else, something about the range of Allied bombers, which has been completely misrepresented even by some people who pretend to be Air Force experts. But either they are not, or they are not terribly good experts. And again, I will give you a source. What you need to do is look up a book by Wesley Craven, C-R-A-V-E-N, Wesley Craven, and James Cate, C-A-T-E, Army Air Forces in World War II, Volume 6, published by University of Chicago Press in 1955, and look up page 207. And on page 207, you will find that the B-24 bomber, the Liberator bomber, could actually fly 2,850 miles without refueling. 2,850 miles, which means that this plane could actually, almost certainly, have reached every population center in Poland the way it was constituted in 1939, including places like Lwów and Wilno, and many other places, and certainly every single extermination camp in Poland. And this, of course, would be especially true if the flights were of a symbolic nature, and such flights, of course, would have had profound moral value. You see, one thing that I know as a Holocaust survivor is that I was in Warsaw in 1943 in April and May when the Polish uprising took place. 1943, no planes, no Allied planes were flying over Warsaw. I was there in 1944, in August and September of 1944, and Allied planes were flying over Warsaw. And of course, you know, you've been told that 150,000 Poles fought in the Allied armies of World War II and Air Forces. I respect their service, and I think it was a wonderful thing. But I would also tell you that 500,000 Jews served in the American Army. And of course, they also served in the British Army. And they served in various Allied armies. So if we were going to go on that kind of basis, then, you know. Okay. Okay, all right. So So, these are a few things, that you might want to remember, and think of the website I gave you. Okay, gentlemen, any other comments or thoughts that you may have, please?
About 8 or 9 years ago, my colleagues at the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies learned that George McGovern, the U.S. Senator and 1972 Democratic presidential nominee, had been one of the pilots, one of the American pilots who had taken part in bombing missions over Auschwitz in 1944. I refer to the fact that there were numerous American and some British bombings of the synthetic oil factories that were in the Auschwitz complex. So we sent a film crew out to South Dakota to Senator McGovern's home to interview him on camera for the first time, to ask him his reflections on that experience as one of the pilots who had actually flown over Auschwitz in late 1944. And his perspective was interesting from a number of points of view, and I'll just briefly mention just a couple. Senator McGovern was, of course, a devout supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, and his judgment had not changed over time. He referred to FDR as his political idol, yet he also said that it was important to recognize even his idol's two major flaws. He said one was, of course, the internment of the Japanese Americans without any evidence that they were disloyal, and the other was the failure to bomb Auschwitz or the railway tracks leading to it. He said, I know we could have done it because I was there. He said, of course, not all the bombs might have hit their targets, but that was true of any of the bombings that the Allies carried out on railroad tracks or other targets. But he said he still felt they should have tried it. Of course, his commanders had never informed any of the pilots or crew that there were people down there being gassed to death. But when asked if he thought that how the crew members would respond if there was a call for volunteers to take part in such missions. In other words, what if their commanders had said, look, here's a humanitarian objective. It's not exactly a military objective, although we are within range for military reasons, but this particular mission to hit those railway tracks or to hit the gas chambers is not a strictly military mission, so we're calling for volunteers. And so we asked Senator McGovern, how do you think they would have responded? And his answer is interesting because it goes directly to a question that was raised earlier by Professor Werrell about he thought that the airmen would not take part in such missions, but McGovern, who was actually there and who actually flew missions with these crew members, what he said was he felt certain that every one of his crewmen would have volunteered for such a mission. Why? Because he said the young men who were fighting World War II, who were fighting in the Allied armies, understood that they were fighting for something greater than, it was not just an ordinary military mission, but they were fighting for a new and better kind of world. And that this was part of their understanding of why they were going to war and why they were risking their lives. And he felt, therefore, that he and his crew members would all certainly have volunteered, despite the obvious risk in such bombing missions, because they recognized that, that interrupting the mass murder process would have been a very worthy part of the overall Allied sense of purpose and meaning in fighting World War II.
Thank you very much. I would also like to add, that in Hungary in 1944, Adolf Eichmann and a crew of 200 fellow murderers were assembling regularly at a hotel, I believe it was the Majestic Hotel in Budapest, and Adolf Eichmann, doesn't of course matter what the name of the hotel was, and Adolf Eichmann lived on Apostol Street in a large yellow villa. That's how it's been described by his biographer. And he followed a routine between the villa and the hotel and various other things for several months. Now, Budapest is only located about 450 air miles from Foggia. Many American aircraft and British aircraft could have reached Foggia. You may recall that the Allies once heard that Admiral Yamamoto was going to visit with Japanese garrisons in Bougainville, and a number of American airplanes were scrambled to meet him and shoot him down, which they did. And one, of course, and of course there were other missions. I think Professor Worrell referred to it, and others referred to the great mission by Colonel Doolittle, the raid over Tokyo, which was a wholly symbolic operation. But no such operations ever were either carried out for the Jews, nor were ever such operations contemplated. And of course, you realize how important they would have been, because, for instance, an operation of this sort over Warsaw in April and May of 1943 would have said to people in Poland, as well as much of Europe, that maybe Jewish lives are worth saving, worth preserving, that maybe Hitler's policy of extermination is wrong, not right, but wrong. But you know, there's a famous saying, silence implies consent, and inactivity does the same thing. And so that's another thing that we may want to reflect on. Well, okay. Yes, okay. Maybe perhaps the audience has questions, and maybe some of us can respond to questions.
Double question. I understand in the Auschwitz complex there was a whole village of SS personnel and Nazi people. Was it technically possible to bomb such a village? And two, did anybody ever consider the possibility of bombing such a village?
The SS barracks actually were bombed by accident in one of those Allied raids on the oil factories. Elie Wiesel, in his famous book Night, describes his experiences as a 16-year-old slave laborer in those factories, and there's a point in the book where he talks about seeing the American planes coming and bombing the area, and how he and the other prisoners cheered, even though they knew they might be hit by the bombs, because they hoped it would interrupt the mass killings. I don't recall the exact number. It's something like 13 or 15 SS men were killed when those barracks were hit by accident.
I want to ask the audience a question. Do any of you recall an old World War II movie in black and white starring James Cagney and called 13 Rue Madeleine? Did anybody see it? Maybe you saw it. Now, this is a very interesting film done during the war, in which James Cagney is an Allied intelligence agent. He's captured by the Gestapo and he's tortured. And his relief comes when Allies come over and bomb the headquarters.
One thing that's important to keep in mind with respect to the military aspect of these operations is that given the capacity of bombers at the time for accuracy, it was considered to be success if you hit within 5 miles of the target. This is not precision bombing. If you look at the maps that are outside the auditorium, you will see the bomb craters that were made when the Allied bombers hit the IG Farben plant, which they did succeed in destroying, but those craters come from Auschwitz about, say, 4 miles away, and that's where the SS units got hit. The issue is not whether it could have been effective. It could have been effective, and it was feasible, and I think you're going to get consensus up here, and Professor Bauer as well. We would have done it. If we'd have been the civilian leadership, we would have ordered it and had it done. Now, we also would have anticipated that maybe we take out a barracks, maybe we do some damage that will kill civilians, because that's going to be part of the risk with non-precision bombing. Today, no problem at all. We could take out the gas chambers, we could take out the headquarters of the SS and not touch anything around it.
Do we have other questions? Yes? Yes, sir.
Since film
film was produced by the Office of War Information. So I'm just wondering if there's a connection in the attitude expressed there and what Professor Leff found a few years ago when she did a study of American press coverage of the liberation of the camps, where, if I recall correctly, you found that even after the war was over and the camps were liberated and the newsreel footage was being seen in theaters around America, much of the mainstream American newspapers were still downplaying the fact that they were Jews. Am I correct? Kind of universalizing what happened. Would you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually something I was going to mention. Can you just stand yourself to Professor taking out what to look at in American
Microphone, please. Come on up here.
Okay, is this better? Everybody can hear me? And again, I would actually also turn to Professor Fleming and be very curious to see if the British coverage was different. But when the camps are liberated in April and May, there are two things that happen in terms of the description of the inmates. The first is that, of course, the military is the first ones to go in, the Allied Signal Corps, and the American military immediately, takes over once they've conquered, if there are any remaining SS, which there were in a few camps, like in Dachau, not in most of them. But then when they're followed by the press, either the military itself, which had camera crews, or our regular press, and the description that was provided of who the inmates were, and some of this is because, as we all know, the camps in Germany, which are the ones that were liberated by the Allies, had not a large percentage of Jews, because there were no Jews left, right? So when you're getting to Buchenwald or Dachau, about 10% of the population is Jewish. It's a little different at Bergen-Belsen. There it's about 40%. But what that means is the way that the inmates are described is they're described by their nationality. They're described as partisans. They're described as dissidents, but they're almost never described as Jews. So another sort of fallacy that emerged in the post-war period is the idea that the moment the world sort of recognized the Holocaust was at the time of liberation. But if you actually look at the press accounts at the time, it would have been very, very difficult to figure out anything about the Holocaust. I mean, you would have realized the Germans did horrible things, committed horrible atrocities, but that this was part, that there had been an ongoing campaign to exterminate the Jews of Europe, you would have not been able to find out during the post-war period, either because of the coverage of the liberation of the camps, or even, interestingly, also to the coverage of the Nuremberg trials. Some of the same issues arise during the Nuremberg trials. First of all, it's not very prominently just covered, and this again is something different from our understanding. So it's the understanding is if it wasn't the liberation of the camps, then it was the Nuremberg trials. But again, looking at the actual press coverage at the time, the Jews play a very, very small part of this, and I think this is part of the continuing strategy for a variety of reasons. Not to acknowledge the extermination, even after there's no danger about backlash or we won't win the war or anything, the same patterns continue. And I don't know if you looked at that. Michael, did you look at that for Britain?
Not really, but the same sort of trends, just browsing through some of these newspapers, you do get the continuation of the marginalization of the Holocaust as such. Now, there was a very interesting film commissioned and actually made in the post-war period, and I think it was organized by the Ministry of Information, and they got in Alfred Hitchcock to supervise the making of this film, and British film crews went all over Germany this is the one, and it wasn't actually released in the final event. It hasn't been seen really by the public at all. So, this is an interesting
It was actually
development.
just in the States, it was on PBS,
Yeah,
in conjunction with the liberation of Auschwitz. But if you watch that film, which I did, again, almost no mention of Jews. I think it's mentioned once, maybe twice. But that's not the way the inmates were described.
I want to add one thing on that point. Professor Bauer said quite eloquently that he felt that America had moral responsibility and was devoted to humanitarian principles. That's very articulate, but I don't believe it. And I'll tell you why I don't believe it. Let's forget the Jews for a moment. We have Roma. We have Poles who are not Jews. We have millions more, over the 6 million. If I were a humanitarian, first of all, I would have cared passionately about those people so that when I got information suggesting they were being systematically slaughtered because of their ethnic or racial characteristics, I at least would have investigated that and most likely would have called in my military advisors and called in my non-military advisors and say, I want every conceivable strategy here. We will drop leaflets, we will make moral statements that this is wrong, and we will do it every week, and we will look at military options. We will look at the Polish underground. We will give the Polish underground money to go and hit these camps, to go and assassinate their commandants, and to do the kinds of things we need to do to disrupt this. Because if we do nothing that saves millions, we at least will make a moral statement that this is wrong, and we stand with these people in their deaths. Now, if I were in the publicity branch, in the Office of War Information, I would have said, okay, we're humanitarians. Let's put the Jews in paragraph 2 or paragraph 3 and make a humanitarian statement about this and saying we have to save millions of lives in Eastern Europe of all these ethnic groups that are being systematically annihilated by Hitler. You can do it that way. You don't have to emphasize the Jews if you don't want to. I personally think I would, because it's unique in a lot of different ways. But let's say I didn't want to do it that way. I could still get the job done. And the Jews would benefit from it as well as the other groups.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
I think I'd like to pose a question that goes on beyond the humanitarian, relates to the moral, goes on beyond the issue of refugees as such, not all Jews, to the underlying issue of the spiritual and religious dimension in the Holocaust. And it was mentioned here in so many quick phrases. The Jew is the enemy. The fact that the Nazis, in their world outlook, did see the Jew as the ultimate enemy for everything they stood for. And they were right. In their way of thinking, the Jew was the enemy. But that would have required, as you said, a realization of the apocalyptic ideology of the Nazis, which does not exist in the West. Now, if that would have existed, here's the question. If that would have existed, and the Jews could have been seen as almost the canary at the time, today the herald at the gate, at the time the canary was told, 6 million yes, but 30, 40 million to follow. Could it have counterweighed the basic anti-Semitism and the decision of Roosevelt that this not be turned into a Jew war? I think that's his phrase. A Jew war, because it would undermine politically the entire Allied effort. Where do these two things balance out? Because the Nazis saw, and this was making believe, saw that the Jews' greatest sin was the corruption of Christianity.
Sir, we'll answer at least, first of all, your question with another question. Were you here for Professor Leff's presentation?
I admit I'm guilty.
Well, she substantially answered your question, you know. That's That's the problem.
And she's still sitting here.
She is still here. Maybe she could give you a little synopsis of what she had said. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead, please. Yes.
I want to ask you, because you're very concerned with morality, and we all are. What do you think of the United States moral position when it took Van Braun and took him into the United States, gave him everything to conduct his rocket experiments so that eventually the United States could attack Russia? I can't understand that kind of morality. Von Braun worked definitively for the Nazis. He had worked on the rockets, and he was hailed and feted
answer this
in the
question.
United States. Have we learned anything about morality today in terms of the United States and what it plans to do in terms of peace with other countries?
You're absolutely right, in my opinion, that the program by the CIA, sometimes with the knowledge of other U.S. government agencies, to bring some Nazi war criminals to the United States and to give them shelter in exchange for things that services they could offer, is a moral stain on America. What more can we say? It was a disgrace. We still haven't learned all of the details of it. We've learned much more in recent years than was known decades ago. And hopefully the full story will come out at some point.
Oh, thank you. We'll go with one more question, and then, yes, sir.
I think it's interesting that somebody mentioned the idea of a Jew war. If you see the exhibit at Yad Vashem concerning the Wannsee Conference, you see that the total number of Jews that were expected to kill was not 6 million, but 11 million, including all of those countries which were never, of course, conquered by the Germans. And that would lead one to believe that one of the basic ideologic purposes of World War I, not just the master race, but the actual extermination of the Jews as a major purpose for the war.
Perhaps we can rest on the statement that you just made, and I'll call for adjournment.